Hi everyone, welcome to the first video of our third unit. This will be on the presidency of Adams, a bit of Jefferson, and the XYZ affair. And if we have time, we'll get into the Alien and Sedition Acts, but you know how that goes once I start talking about things. I want to avoid some confusion here. That last unit was Washington's presidency, basically, right, with the Whiskey Rebellion and things. But then at the end, to show about the different branches of government, we jumped into Marbury versus Madison. Now remember, that's the end of and beginning of the Adams and the Jeffersonian presidency. So it wasn't all like chronologically in order. That was more of like a theme we connected it with. So what we're going to discuss now is Washington had 2 terms as president, and he chose then to step down. That was a precedent that he set. Now there is a term limit for 2 offices of the presidency. That didn't exist in his time. That's just something he chose to do. So the first real election where you don't get Washington, so it's not really the first election, but the first election after him is the election of 1796. And this was between Adams and Jefferson. Now, Jefferson didn't actively campaign, but he did have people that campaigned for him, known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. Adams did actively campaign. Both men had a lot in common. We both know they drafted the Declaration of Independence and were quite the revolutionaries, even though Jefferson gets much more credit for his involvement with that. They were friends. They sort of became frenemies, and they became friends again and started writing and corresponding with each other again right before their death. And you may know the story of how they both died literally on the same day, on July 2nd, 50 years to the day after signing of the Declaration of Independence. They were both foreign ministers, Adams to England and Jefferson to France, and they were both members of Washington's cabinet, Adams being vice president and Jefferson being Secretary of State. Adams was known for being, I guess, quite neat and almost his, what's the right word for it? His appreciation for royalty, I guess, right? We mentioned that, what he proposed the president should be called. And he would show up to vice president as vice president with things like sabers at his side, it was like a uniform. And people would be like, what's this about, Adams? We're a democracy. But I'll read a little bit from the book you've heard me read from a few times. I'll try to start changing the books up more. But this is from Washington's Circle, since they were actually both members of Washington's Circle. And on page 22 and 23, they describe a little bit about Adams. He reminded, Ben Franklin had said John Adams was always an honest man, often a great one, but sometimes absolutely mad. John Adams had known George Washington since the early days of the Revolution, but they were never friends. They were a study in contrast in almost every respect. Washington was tall, and then it says Adams was short. Adams had protruding eyes that were usually blinking and animated. Some would say darting. Adams was a Harvard man who would read voraciously and talked back to books by scribbling ferociously in their margins. Adams argued freely and expressed his opinion with peppery phrases on any subject with equal surety, a habit that irked Ben Franklin to no end. Even men who did not like Washington admired him, but Adams often irritated people without any offsetting advantages. He could be petty in his jealousies and said acid things about people that he later had cause to regret. And this deals with the story I told you about last week in the other video about him and Martha Washington. After Washington's death, when he bitterly remarked that Washington would never have commanded the army or become president if he had not married a rich widow. He actually wasn't the only one who thought that. Let's see. That's good enough on Adams. Jefferson, unlike his neat companion there, Adams was quite the difference, right? We said how much he liked his moccasins. I'll read here. Um, he spoke softly, his temper was mellow. His tendency to withdraw and spend time by himself made him introspective and bashful. He mastered classical languages quickly. He entered the College of William and Mary at age 16. He became a tireless investigator of the natural world, watching caterpillars and looking for fossils. Books, however, became and would remain the center of his life. Now, if you guys know, he dedicated and gave a lot of his books to what became like the first library of Congress. More on his appearance, Jefferson was always rumpled, preoccupied, mumbling, and deliberate, creating the impression of a man constantly searching for a paper he had mislaid. And I think that's good for now. Now, during the election, Adams got 71 electoral votes, and Jefferson got 68, which at that time meant that the person who was second became vice president. Now, of course, those laws or rules have changed. Can you imagine that, like, if that didn't change, like today, Trump would be the president, but Hillary Clinton would be our vice president? How well do you think that would go over? Maybe it would be productive, who knows, but something to think about. So into Adams's presidency, you get a crisis with France. Hoping to ease relations between the two countries, he sent 3 commissioners to negotiate an accord with them. The commissioners were known as X, Y, and Z, but we know them as Marshall, Pinckney, and Gerry. 3 people we've actually mentioned in this class already. When they got there, the French minister was this guy Talleyrand. And he made it clear from the beginning that the success of this mission depended on them giving a loan to the French government and also $240,000 of a gratuity for themselves. Now, that basically means Talleyrand wanted a bribe. Marshall and Pinckney were mad and they sailed home. Elbridge Gerry, who we might remember was an anti-federalist during the ratification, stayed there, hoping that Talleyrand would not declare war, because he thought maybe if all 3 of them did, France would declare war. Adams reported to Congress what happened with this affair, and the American public was outraged. The Federalists exploited this blunder. Secretary of State Pickering urged an immediate declaration of war. Federalist congressmen replied, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute." In other words, we'll raise money to fight a war against France, but hell, we're not going to be paying them bribery money. Adams found himself to be a little bit of an unexpected hero about this, caught up in all the anti-French furor at the time. The nation, he said, had never been in greater danger, and people called this like a quasi-war because there were some naval encounters between American and French ships. The Republicans, however, were in a bit of disarray. Publicly, they deplored the way France acted, and they pledged to uphold the nation's honor, but they were also alarmed about just how far the Federalists were responding and what were the Federalist intentions. And we see the Federalists did respond in a pretty extreme way, and that is what pulls us into the Alien and Sedition Acts. A little bit here just about Talleyrand. He was the French guy who sort of got us in trouble with this XYZ affair. He was an aristocrat as a child. He walked with a limp. But he thought, as many Europeans did at the time, that this is what foreign ministers do. You're supposed to get paid for your services. So he didn't really consider it a bribe. But of course, the Americans did take it that way. And someone who's very like cunning and resourceful in politics is now called a Talleyrand after him. Okay, so the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed by the Fifth Congress. In May of 1798, Congress called for rapid development of naval forces that could defend themselves against an attack on France. I'm going to get into this more next class. We're running out of time, and I did go off on some rants. But I want to think, how should we have responded to the XYZ affair? And we're going to think, was the Alien and Sedition Acts a proper response, or did it go a little bit too far? Okay, we'll pick up here next class. And if you have any questions on this, ask me, and we can always mention it